Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com, and this is anti-war news for Wednesday, October 12th, 2022. The first story at the top of antiwar.com today. Another sign that the U.S. does not want this war to end. U.S. officials rule out pushing Ukraine to negotiate. So, this is according to the Washington Post. They reported on Tuesday that U.S. officials have ruled out pushing Ukraine to negotiate with Russia even though they don't think either side can win the war outright. So I'm just going to read from this paragraph from this Washington Post report. It says, quote, privately, U.S. officials say neither Russia nor Ukraine is capable of winning the war outright, but they have ruled out the idea of pushing or even nudging Ukraine to the negotiating table. They say they do not know what the end of the war looks like or how it might end or when, insisting that is up to Kiev. End quote. So they're saying that they don't think Ukraine can win the war, but they're still not going to push them to negotiate with Russia. Um, and a State Department official told the Washington Post that pursuing negotiations with Russia or figuring out how the war is going to end is a decision for the Ukrainians to make. The official said that Washington's, quote, job now is to help them be in absolutely the best position militarily on the battlefield for that day when they do choose to go to the diplomatic table, end quote. So we've heard this line from the Biden administration throughout the war, from the very early days until now. They've said, when asked if they're pushing for a diplomatic solution or if they think Ukraine should negotiate with Russia, the answer is usually, we think our job is to arm Ukraine to give them the best leverage at the negotiating table. But they never seem to get to that negotiating table except for at the end of March when Turkey hosted talks between Russian and Ukrainian officials. And virtual talks followed that seemed promising, but that those peace talks were scuttled, um, in part due to Boris Johnson going to Ukraine and reportedly telling Zelensky that even if he was ready to sign a deal with Russia, the West was not. But this report from the Washington Post, and I have to give credit to Aaron Monte. I linked to his tweet here because he tweeted this out, and I would have missed it if I didn't see that. But this report, it comes after Ukraine hardened its stance on negotiations with Russia in response to Putin's annexation of 4 Ukrainian territories. So, in response to that annexation, Zelensky signed a decree ruling out peace talks with Russia as long as Putin is president, essentially calling for regime change in Moscow. And the lack of a U.S. push for diplomacy to end the war comes after President Biden warned that the risk of nuclear Armageddon was higher now than at any time since the 1962 missile crisis. Since Biden made that warning, things have escalated. Russia escalated the war on Monday in response to the truck bombing of the Kerch Bridge that connects Crimea to the Russian mainland, with wide scale missile strikes on power infrastructure across Ukraine, a war tactic that he has not really used up to this point until Monday. And since the Russian escalation, the U.S. and NATO have vowed to continue supporting Ukraine. Biden recently signed a stopgap funding bill into law that included $16 billion in new aid for Ukraine, and that brings the total authorized U.S. spending for the war to over $67 billion, which is higher than Russia's entire military budget for 2021. The Washington Post report said that President Biden at some point had to tell Zelensky that he would have a hard time asking Congress for more money to spend on the war if Ukraine seemed ungrateful. So, if you remember earlier in the war, Zelensky often said that the US and NATO were not doing enough to support Ukraine, even as they were shipping billions and billions of weapons into Ukraine, spending all this money. And it does appear that, while Zelensky's still calling for military aid, it does seem like he's kind of backed off the harsher language against the US and NATO. But some of his top officials have not. And I linked to an article that I wrote the other day about Ukraine complaining to the EU about delays in delivering billions in economic assistance, saying that The delays were not acceptable. And that was an economic advisor to Zelensky that said that. Okay, so the next one, more about negotiations, and it's not a good sign from what the U.S. is saying. So Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said on Tuesday that Moscow was open to talks with Western powers as Turkey is looking to broker negotiations, but the U.S. quickly dismissed his comments. Lavrov also said that Russia would consider a meeting between Putin and Biden if one was proposed. He said, quote, "We have repeatedly said that we never refuse meetings. If there is a proposal, then we will consider it," end quote. So a potential venue for talks between Biden and Putin could be the sidelines of the upcoming summit of G20 leaders that will be held in mid-November in Indonesia. But according to Lavrov, Russia has not received any serious proposals from the U.S. to negotiate. And the U.S. was quick to dismiss his comments, accusing Lavrov of posturing and calling for Russia to stop launching strikes across Ukraine. So Ned Price, the State Department spokesman, he said, quote, "We see this as posturing. We do not see this as a constructive, legitimate offer to engage in the dialogue and diplomacy that is absolutely necessary to see an end to this brutal war of aggression," end quote. So, despite the U.S. dismissal of potential talks, Turkey appears eager to broker negotiations between the two sides. The Kremlin said, so Putin is going to meet with Erdogan this week on Thursday in Kazakhstan. And the Kremlin said that it's possible that the two leaders will discuss a Turkish proposal to host talks between the West and Russia. So, they say the West, but obviously the leader in this effort to support Ukraine is clearly the U.S. But Turkey's defense minister spoke with his Russian counterpart, the Russian defense minister Sergei Shoigu, on Tuesday. And according to a readout of the call by the Turkish Defense Ministry, Turkey's defense minister, Hulusi Akar, if I said that name right, he noted a common understanding when it came to the need to reach a ceasefire. The Turkish readout said, quote, "The importance of declaring a ceasefire urgently in order to prevent further loss of lives and to reestablish peace and stability in the region was emphasized. And it was gladly observed that there was a common understanding regarding the ceasefire," end quote. So it sounds like Turkey's really pushing for a ceasefire, for talks here, while the U.S. is doing the opposite. And while there are growing calls for peace talks, not just from Turkey, but from people within the U.S., not within the government, but former U.S. officials, as I went over yesterday. Mike Mullen, the former Joint Chiefs of Staff chairman under Bush and Obama, said that the U.S. should, push hard to get Russia and Ukraine to the table. But Zelensky, he reiterated his position on Tuesday that he would not hold talks with Russia as long as Putin is president during a virtual meeting with the G7. So we're not getting really any sign from either Ukraine or the U.S. that diplomacy is something that they want to pursue. All right, the next one here, NATO will hold nuclear exercise despite tensions with Russia. So NATO plans to hold nuclear exercises next week despite soaring tensions with Russia that have led to President Biden warning of the risk of nuclear Armageddon. So these exercises are known as Steadfast Noon. They are an annual NATO exercise, and the exact location of the exercises are not clear yet. But a NATO official told AP that the main part of the drills would be held more than 625 miles from Russian territory, so over 1,000 kilometers. So not close to Russia, which is good at least. But the exercises typically involve nuclear-capable warplanes, but do not include live fire exercises. So 14 out of the 30 NATO members are expected to take part in this year's iteration of Steadfast Noon. So Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, he said, quote, It would send a very wrong signal if we suddenly now canceled a routine, long time planned exercise because of the war in Ukraine. That would be absolutely the wrong signal to send, end quote. So he's claiming that the best way to avoid escalation with Russia is for NATO to continue its firm and predictable military behavior. He said, quote, if we now created the grounds for any misunderstandings, miscalculations in Moscow about our willingness to protect and defend all allies, we would increase the risk of escalation, end quote. So, he's just saying that NATO has to appear that they're tough. That's the signal that they have to send to Russia. And talking about nuclear simulations, nuclear exercises, there's only 3 NATO members that have their own nuclear arsenals, and that's the U.S., Britain, and France. But other countries store U.S. warheads under NATO's nuclear sharing program. Under this agreement, Belgium, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and Turkey all host U.S. nuclear weapons. Now, I'm not sure about the arrangement in each country. I think it varies how much control they actually have over these warheads. But Germany has a fleet of warplanes that they keep specifically to drop these bombs. So that I guess that means that Germany has the capability to drop nuclear warheads themselves, even though they don't have their own arsenal. But Poland has been talking. They want the U.S. to host nuclear weapons, and said last week that it raised the idea with Washington. Now, the U.S. and NATO have previously said that they would not put nuclear weapons in countries east of Germany that joined the alliance after the Cold War. But Poland's president Duda said that the issue is being discussed with the U.S. And since Poland said that, I haven't seen really the U.S. or NATO say that is not a possibility. So we kept up the one about Admiral Mullen calling for the U.S. to push for talks to end the war, because I think that's a pretty important thing that he said there. But now I just want to take a moment to mention again that it is our fundraiser, and we could really use your help. We're doing pretty good, but it's moving a little slower than we would like. When it's fundraiser season, we put a lot of focus into raising money. And the quicker we get these things done, the more we can focus on our work. But at the top of the page, we just have a great endorsement from Colonel Douglas McGregor, who has been just such an important voice. But one thing I think that we do pretty well at antiwar.com is sort of extracting what are pretty big scoops in mainstream news outlets. For example, this Washington Post one that U.S. officials rule out pushing Ukraine to negotiate, because that was buried in a story that was it wasn't even really about that. It was about how Biden was working to maintain the consensus on arming Ukraine. So we kind of extract important information. We sift through this stuff so you don't have to. And another example of that was the other day I wrote up. There was this Intercept report, again, another buried scoop, that U.S. Special Operations Forces are on the ground in Ukraine, as well as CIA operatives. Now, we knew from other reports that there was CIA, but as far as I know, that was the first report, confirmation from U.S. officials, unnamed sources, but still, I don't see why they would have a reason to lie about that. But that was the first confirmation I know that there's U.S. troops, Special Operations Forces in Ukraine. I haven't seen that picked up really anywhere else. So, yeah, I think that's why a reason to support us, because we sift through all that stuff so you don't have to. So go to antiwar.com/donate, and you'll see all the ways that you can donate. So please help us out. All right, back to the news here. This one is not a surprise. The G7 and NATO vow to continue arming Ukraine after Russian missile barrage. So both the Group of 7 nations and NATO vowed on Tuesday to continue supporting Ukraine in the wake of a Russian missile barrage across Ukraine that marked an escalation in the war. So Russian missile and drone strikes continued across Ukraine on Tuesday, although they were not as intense as Monday's strikes, but they still appeared to target power, energy infrastructure, and things like that. According to Ukrainian officials, the Russian strikes have killed 19 people. The leaders of the G7 nations, they convened a virtual meeting and issued a statement that said they would support Ukraine for the long term. So they convened this meeting on these Russian strikes. So the G7 leaders said in a statement, quote, "We will continue to provide financial, humanitarian, military, diplomatic, and legal support and will stand firmly with Ukraine for as long as it takes," end quote. So Zelensky, he attended part of the G7 meeting and asked for the nations to provide what he called an air shield by supplying more military aid. So he's asking for air defenses and things like that. He said, quote, "I am asking you to strengthen the overall effort to help financially with the creation of an air shield for Ukraine. Millions of people will be grateful to the group of seven for such assistance," end quote. So on Monday, Biden spoke with Zelensky and vowed that the U.S. would provide them with advanced air defenses. And in another article, I'll go over more details about that. But over in Brussels, Stoltenberg said that the military alliance NATO will agree to send more weapons to Ukraine at a meeting of NATO ministers that will start on Wednesday. So NATO defense ministers are holding, I believe it's 2 days of meetings in Brussels this week. Actually, I'm not sure if it's in Brussels. It might be the one that Lloyd Austin chairs in Germany. I'm not sure, but we'll figure that out later in the week. But he said that NATO will step up and sustain our support for Ukraine. And NATO countries have been working to step up weapons production as their stockpiles have been depleted by sending arms to Ukraine. So Stoltenberg is saying that they need to increase production so they can both replenish their stockpiles of weapons that they've sent to Ukraine, but also to continue supporting Ukraine. So you just see who's making the money on this, just the Western arms makers in the US and Europe, just cashing in so much on this Ukraine policy. The NATO leader said that Ukraine must win the war because a Russian victory would be a defeat for NATO. He said, quote, "It is important for all of us that Ukraine wins the battle, the war against the invading Russian forces. Because if Putin wins, that is not only a big defeat for Ukrainians, but it will be a defeat and dangerous for all of us," end quote. All right. So the next one here, the U.S. to expedite the shipment of air defense systems to Ukraine. So the White House said on Tuesday that the U.S. is speeding up the shipment of an air defense system to Ukraine after Russia launched that major barrage of missile strikes. So the U.S. has pledged to give Ukraine 8 national advanced surface-to-air missile systems, known as NASAMS, but so far none of them have been delivered. The NASAMS are being provided to Ukraine through the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, which allows the U.S. government to purchase military equipment for Ukraine, but the process takes longer than sending arms directly from Pentagon stockpiles. So John Kirby, who is the National Security Council spokesman, he said that 2 NASAMS should get to Ukraine soon, and he's saying that they're going to expedite them. Biden spoke with Zelensky. I mentioned in the previous article on Monday that and said they would be sending over air defense systems. So the NASAMS missile systems, they're said to be pretty advanced. They're what the U.S. uses to protect the airspace over the White House and the Pentagon. And they are a joint project between the Norway-based Kongsberg Defense and Aerospace Company and Raytheon, the U.S. arms maker, which is the former employer of Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense. Before taking his post at the Pentagon, Austin served as a board member for Raytheon, and the company has benefited greatly from the U.S. policy of arming Ukraine. And also on Tuesday, the Kremlin said that by sending air defense systems, the U.S. would prolong the conflict and inflict more pain on Ukraine. Okay, the next one here is from Jason Ditz. So the IAEA leaked one of its reports on on Iran's nuclear program to the media. And Jason writes that the latest IAEA media leaks on an Iran report, which are not strictly on a new report, but rather it's an updated report. They're again accusing Iran of expanding their uranium enrichment program. So these leaks, they're consistent in claiming that Iran's enrichment is getting faster, though they tend to ignore that Iran has made these steps reversible. So as Iran has stepped up its enrichment and centrifuges, they've said that they could reverse them, and they're using it as leverage in negotiations, which with the U.S. as part of returning to the Iran deal. So um, as the negotiations prolong, they're not really being held right now, to my knowledge. But as the we're further away from the Iran nuclear deal, Iran continues to increase its nuclear program. That's all leverage that they can use, and they're not under restrictions that like under the nuclear deal. So these reports, they kind of just sound alarmist in the media that Ukraine, sorry, I keep saying Ukraine, that Iran is increasing uranium enrichment, but they're not. They're still, that doesn't mean that they're working to build a bomb. That just means that they're advancing. They're doing nuclear activity that um, they don't have any restrictions on because the U.S. pulled out of the nuclear deal way back in 2018. But it makes a catchy headline and it makes their nuclear program sound scary. All right, so the last one here, this is from Connor Eccles at Responsible Statecraft. So President Biden wants to work with Congress to reevaluate the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia following OPEC's recent decision to significantly cut oil production. This is John Kirby again, National Security Council spokesman. He told CNN, quote, "The president's been very clear that this is a relationship that we need to continue to reevaluate and that we need to be willing to revisit. He's willing to work with Congress. I don't think through what that relationship ought to look like going forward." Sorry, I said that wrong. He said that he's willing to work with Congress to think through what the relationship ought to look like going forward. So this is interesting. Again, this is all about OPEC deciding to cut oil production. And the Democrats are very unhappy, including Bob Menendez, who's saying the U.S. should freeze all aspects of cooperation with Saudi Arabia, including arms sales and security cooperation. 3 Democratic House members went further on Friday when they introduced a bill that would mandate the removal of all American military assets from Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Also on Sunday, Senator Richard Blumenthal, Democrat from Connecticut, and Rep. Ro Khanna, Democrat from California, in the House, they announced a bicameral proposal that would immediately halt all U.S. arms sales to Saudi Arabia. Blumenthal and Khanna, they wrote an op-ed for Politico and said that their bill is already garnering bipartisan support in both chambers. So it's interesting. It seems like they're really unhappy with Saudi Arabia, and maybe this is a good opportunity kind of to push against the supporting them in the war in Yemen and everything, because those bills are still sitting. They've been introduced in the House and the Senate, the war powers resolutions that would end U.S. support for the war. And they are actually, that's the subject of our spotlight from Scott Horton. He wrote a good piece here about these Yemen resolutions, calling for Republicans to get behind them because there is a lot of bipartisan support, over 100 co-sponsors, but it still is mostly Democrats. So this is Scott's pitch to get the more Republicans on board. So go check that out. And then if you want to get involved, which you should, you could call 1-833-STOP-WAR. You can go to 1-833-STOP-WAR.com and they'll connect you to your representative and senator. And there's a little prompt here where calling instructions for what to say. Because I know I always feel awkward stuff like this, and it's nice to read off of a prompt like this, and it has specific instructions. If you have a Democrat, if you're speaking with a Democrat or a Republican, it's good stuff here. So hopefully this stuff with Saudi Arabia is an opportunity to really push this. And so far, since the ceasefire in Yemen expired, there's been reports of fighting on the ground, but thankfully no reports of Saudi airstrikes. So hopefully something changes here. in a good way. Hopefully, the U.S. pressures Saudi Arabia to lift the blockade. But that's it for me for today. We have a lot of good viewpoints. The one from Scott, Michael Clare, and Tom Engelhardt, Medea Benjamin, Norman Solomon, Doug Bandow. A pretty stacked lineup today. Go check those out. Please support us. And if you're listening, we're also on YouTube and Odyssey. You can subscribe there and just to get those numbers up. But that's it for me for today. I will catch you tomorrow with some more news. Thank you for listening.